Welcome, everybody. My name is Manisha Thomas. I'm with PHAP, and it is my pleasure to have you join us for today's webinar on humanitarian response and loss and damage finance, coordinating action to meet rising needs. This is the 8th session of the learning stream on climate change and humanitarian action, which is being organized by both ICFA and PHAP. And it's my pleasure to introduce my co-facilitator from ICFA, Nishani. Nishani, I'm going to hand over to you for a quick welcome.
Hi, everyone. It's been a while. We haven't had a webinar in ages, but we've had a few other events happening. So looking forward to connecting all that up with today's webinar. And yeah, thank you. Over to you, back to you, Manisha.
Thanks very much, Nishani. And before we start talking about what we're going to do in the webinar today, we're going to take a quick look at the poll results that many of you hopefully answered as you came in. And the question we had was, how familiar are you with the concept of loss and damage in climate change? And we got about 60% of you who are somewhat familiar, 24% not at all familiar, and 16% are very familiar. So I think it does speak to the audience today that this is a very useful topic in terms of understanding what loss and damage is in climate action. And I think our presenters today will be able to give us some good insights. So those of you who are very familiar may hear a bit of repetition, but for the rest of you, hopefully there will be new things. And for those who are very familiar, we do invite you, obviously, to provide comments and questions in the chat and Q&A, as Marcus suggested. Before we hand over to our panelists, I'm going to turn over to Nishani for a few brief introductory remarks on the topic of today's webinar. Nishani, please.
Thanks so much, Manisha. So there are 2 recordings that I hope you have managed to listen to before you joined us. One was our last webinar under topic 7, Understanding Loss and Damage and Links to Humanitarian Action, that we really kind of tried to unpack a little bit more on what loss and damage was there. And the other one is the session at ICFA's annual conference this year, which is on gaps in climate financing and implications for humanitarian action. My colleague Edith will share the separate links on the chat if you haven't already heard the recordings. So just to kind of maybe get us all up to speed a little bit, the shocks driving the needs for humanitarian assistance are both sudden and slow onset, and vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change is often experienced at the same time as other risk factors, notably conflicts, socioeconomic fragility, and we in the humanitarian sector are working in many of these contexts day in, day out. In our annual conference session on gaps in climate financing and implications for humanitarian action, one of the key points raised by all the speakers was that there's little or no climate financing going to conflict and fragile contexts for climate adaptation. So more and more, we are seeing the need for humanitarian programs to incorporate at least some form of adaptation measures in contexts where we work in, as this is being done with limited, already overstretched, yearly dispersed, and most often earmarked humanitarian funding that we receive. However, with desertification, rising temperatures, and extreme weather events that we are seeing, such as the drought and the famine that led to famine in East Horn of Africa, floods in Pakistan, and multiple cyclones in Mozambique, to name some, in many places where we work, adaptation is becoming almost impossible. And whatever adaptation measures we are taking, we need to realize that it will not be enough if we do not make mitigation action, if we do not take mitigation action and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by moving away from fossil fuels. Because what we are seeing now, more and more increasingly, is increasing losses and damages, loss of lives, homes, livelihoods, ways of life, opportunities for education, increasing SGBV instances and violence, loss of cultural and traditional practices due to people having to move and being displaced. And in 2020 alone, we saw climate-related disasters resulted in over 220 billion in economic loss and damages. It affected 185 million people and resulted in over 30,000 deaths. This is what we know so far. So during our webinar, Understanding Loss and Damage and Links to Humanitarian Action, the first one where we explained a little bit, we heard 2 challenges from you, and that especially from humanitarian actors when engaging in humanitarian response and loss and damage. One was funding, nothing new. And then 2 is coordination, nothing new again. So at global levels, we are seeing these multiple systems, policies, decision-making processes, and funding arrangements at play. We have the UNFCCC on climate change, and with it, the related climate financing mechanisms, the SDG processes and funding for development with IFIs and governments, Sendai Framework for Action on DRR, the Humanitarian Coordination System and its funding mechanisms. And then I don't even know how the peace building funding architecture looks like or works. So when you look at the country level, this is slightly different. The majority of humanitarian assistance is received in the first instance by UN agencies and international NGOs, majority, in the form of grants. For reasons of neutrality, impartiality, it's very little or rarely that international humanitarian assistance is provided to national governments. And in contrast, most of the development assistance and development funding and climate finance is provided to national governments, with the majority provided in forms of loans or other financial products. And funding on loss and damage, now that is not even decided yet. We will learn more about what we could and would likely see and what it could look like from Harjeet, hopefully, and I'm looking at you, Harjeet. So that's finance for adaptation, preparedness, responding to climate change impacts remains very distinctly siloed. And there is a lack of coherence and complementarity in terms of when it's mobilized and for what purpose. And these modalities are responding to a spectrum of objectives, from reducing emissions to building resilience and improving adaptation capacities, to lessening impacts and to helping communities recover from shocks. So what we're seeing is we are ending up rather with gaps in what gets financed, where it gets financed, who can access this funding and finance, and who ultimately receives and benefits from this finance. And this means that individuals or communities will only have some of their needs partially met, and this is a huge challenge we are all facing. The overall coordination and coherence of programming and finance required to meet all of the needs of people at risk or affected by climate shocks, and especially in conflict and fragile contexts, is a bit overwhelming, to say the least. So the call right now, in terms of loss and damage, is for additional and ambitious finance for loss and damage, which is meant to avert, minimize, and address the adverse and unavoidable effects of climate change, and to support countries in their relief, recovery, and rehabilitation efforts in the aftermath of a climate event. But even with loss and damage finance, there's still a huge concern that countries with the most complicated operating contexts, such as where we are working in, and the coverage of categories of vulnerabilities and dimensions of risk, such as conflict, socioeconomic fragility, cannot be left behind. So ensuring this requires more and better coordination between humanitarian, climate actors, and other actors, of course, as well, at all levels, and additional finance to close the humanitarian finance gap and to fulfill climate commitments, and better transparency and reporting to ensure donors are accountable for their commitments, and we are accountable to communities, is extremely crucial and critical. So with all that, during this webinar, we hope to unpack some of these challenges to understand better what are some of the opportunities to advocate, better coordinate our funding and responses with the common goal to serve communities who are most vulnerable better, and be it through humanitarian response or through mechanisms of loss and damage that are being put in place. This is something we are hoping to discuss today. So over to you, Manisha, so that we can introduce our amazing panel who's going to tackle all these really easy, simple topics, of course.
I was going to say, Nishani, that's quite a lot that you've packed in there into the introductory remarks, so that you put a lot on the table for our panelists to unpack in the next hour and 20 minutes. So, but I have no problem. I have no worries that our panel will be able to tackle all those different questions that you have put on the table. So to better help us understand loss and damage and the relationship to humanitarian action, we're joined by 3 speakers today. We've got Debbie Hillier, who is the head at Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. Welcome, Debbie. We have Harjeet Singh, who's head of global political strategy with Climate Action Network International, or CANI. And last but not least, we have Angus Urquhart, who is the crisis and humanitarian lead at Development Initiatives. And we're going to hear from all three of those before we come back to answering the questions that I see we are already getting in the Q&A, which is excellent. And I know that some of you will be touching on those questions that are there. And for those of you who aren't speaking, please do feel free as panelists to reply to some of those questions in writing if you wish, just so that we can try to get through as many questions as possible. And so, Angus, I'm going to first turn to you in terms of trying to set the scene a little bit to outline where humanitarian need is in terms of where climate finance is falling short, included in cases like Pakistan. And maybe you can help outline a little bit those top line gaps between the two systems beyond what Nishani's already kind of alluded to in her introductory remarks. So, Angus, I'm going to turn to you first, please.
Super. Many thanks, Manisha, and hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever we find you today. Yes, my task, I think, is to set the scene for you today. So we've got a few slides to show from analysis that we've recently done in our Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, which we published a couple of weeks ago. So if any of this is of interest to you, please do seek it out on our website. I think, as you say, Manisha, I think my task is hopefully to provide a little bit of that context. So what do we look at when we see in terms of humanitarian need? What's happened in terms of the trends of finance that have been mobilized to try and meet that need? And then how does that humanitarian finance sit within the broader landscape of financing responses to countries that are experiencing crisis? So to kind of kick us off, I think this is a context and perhaps a slide that's unsurprising to nearly all of you on the line. But what we've seen over the past years is a very rapid escalation in the level of people experiencing humanitarian crisis. Even in the last 5 years, we've seen a doubling in the number of those who are experiencing humanitarian crisis or who are identified as being in humanitarian need. So that includes all of those who are addressed by UN coordinated appeals, but equally also those in other countries that are experiencing humanitarian crisis, where the UN isn't present, either through scale or through lack of access. And if we look across where the data is even slightly weaker, over the last 10 years, we've seen perhaps even a quadrupling of that level of need. What does this mean in terms of climate change? Well, we know that climate change is an increasingly important driver and contributory factor to that. So in 2022, 58% of those people in need were living in countries that were highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But of course, it's not just about climate change. We also know that in most of these contexts, and in an increasing number of these contexts, the drivers and causes of crisis are increasingly complex. So it's climate change, but combined with conflict, with socioeconomic fragility. So in three quarters of these people in need are living in countries which are experiencing a combination of at least two of conflict, impacts of climate change, or high levels of socioeconomic vulnerability. So we can see that climate change is one of those significant contributory factors, but it's not the sole factor. What do we see then when we look at kind of the finance that's been mobilized to this? You can see that in 2022, the total volume of humanitarian assistance, so in here we're looking at public sources of finance, so from governments, EU institutions, but also contributions from private donors, well, that's individuals, corporations, trusts, foundations, for instance. We've seen a fairly significant increase, and in fact, even an unprecedented increase in 2022. Primarily, that's been in response to the crisis in Ukraine, but also to the food insecurity crisis in East Africa, which have been some of the primary areas where that finance has been directed. Looking at previous years, I think the sense was before 2022 that we'd perhaps reached a context in which maybe we'd reached peak aid. Aid was stagnating. And I think what this raises the question for us now is, in terms of humanitarian response, is 2022 really just an exceptional year? And will we see a return and a fall away in terms of humanitarian assistance as we move through 2023 and increasingly, I think, into 2024? And I think there's also a wider context to this, which is humanitarian assistance forms just one part of that wider bundle of official development assistance that's provided to countries that are experiencing crisis. We know that official development assistance has grown, But we also know that humanitarian assistance is accounting for a greater proportion of that assistance. So from 2021 to 2022, it grew from 15 to 17% of that total assistance. But what we also know is that that development assistance bubble is being squeezed by other demands. And in particular, in 2022, a large volume of that assistance was spent on in-country donor refugee spending. Why this matters, I think, is that we are seeing more humanitarian assistance, but equally, at the same time, those wider sources of funding that can address longer term needs in countries in crisis is being particularly squeezed, whether those are climate related or wider development related. Who's providing this assistance? And what does this tell us? I mean, in terms of the humanitarian context, I think one of the key things to note is that this funding is discretionary. So governments are not held to a particular common set of contributions, and therefore the volumes that are provided vary very significantly between donors and vary very significantly in terms of their overall capability to provide. So if we measure that in terms of the proportion of their national income that they provide. And you can see here that in 2022, there are three sources of funding that dominate this chart that you can see. The US, Germany, and EU institutions provide 60% of all of that funding. There are only 20 donors that provide 98% of all of the public contributions of humanitarian assistance. And I think this means two things. One is that we see, because it's discretionary, quite a high level of variance and an uneven spread of that funding between crises. But also what it means is that we have a very fragile humanitarian system. So a change amongst any one of these leading donors could have a fairly significant impact on the overall capability of the system to respond. And so what does that mean in terms of the insufficiency or the sufficiency of that response, as Nishani has already alluded to? Well, we know, and it's well documented, that levels of funding for humanitarian response are insufficient. They fail to meet the level of need. And the best proxy we have for that are the contributions made towards UN coordinated appeals. You can see in the chart at the bottom, which tells you the proportion of those needs that are met, that we're around about the 60% over the last decade, just below those levels in 2022. We also know that the funding here behind these figures is very concentrated among a number of large crises. So 10 large crises account for a large proportion of all of that assistance. And that most of these countries that are receiving humanitarian assistance now are countries that are in protracted crisis. 92% of all funding in 2022 went to countries that were experiencing protracted crisis, so that had 5 or more years of UN coordinated appeals. And I think what this tells us is not only are we seeing new crises, but where crises exist, they're not being resolved. People who are experiencing crisis are not able to address their needs. They're not able to resolve the crises. They're not able to move away from humanitarian assistance into longer term development assistance. And climate change is an increasingly important contributory factor to that. Of course, it's not all about the volumes of finance that are being provided. And I think in the conversations that we'll have later, we'll talk about the importance of the way in which finance is organized, how it's coordinated, and where it's provided and to whom. The humanitarian assistance, as many of you will know, has attempted over recent years to reform the effectiveness and efficiency with which it operates, focusing in particular on questions around providing more funding to local national actors, greater volumes of funding that has great quality, so predictable, flexible funding, but also trying to provide more of that funding in a form that reaches recipients more quickly and more effectively. So for instance, through cash and voucher assistance. I think the overall picture is one of slow progress and fairly varied progress. Looking here at funding to local and national actors, the funding that we can see, that we can track of direct funding to local national actors has fallen away even over the last 5 years. So only about 1.2% in 2022 was provided directly to local and national actors. In terms of the quality funding that's received by local and national actors, again, whilst we aren't able to track very clearly, we know anecdotally that the quality of funding, once it's passed through the transaction chain to the final recipients, often that quality has been reduced. Where we do see some progress, slightly more positive, I think, is in terms of the provision of cash and voucher assistance. So we know that more assistance is provided as cash and voucher assistance, and that grew again in 2022 to a record amount of about 7.9 billion, about 20% of all international humanitarian assistance. So what does this mean in terms of, I guess, the wider picture that we're looking at? We know that humanitarian response is only one element of the wider responses to countries that are experiencing crises where climate change is a significant contributory factor. Humanitarian response is about kind of addressing immediate acute needs. It's mostly on the kind of the immediate response part of this cycle that you can see, although with increasing volumes and an increasing focus on anticipatory action. Obviously, it's only one part of this wider system. And what this means is that we need to ensure that there's a degree of coherence and coordination between different forms of finance. The current reality, however, is that what we see across the system is a insufficiency, but also a lack of join up and a lack of coherence between those different forms of finance. Specifically looking at climate finance, and here we're looking at funding that's provided through multilateral climate funds. I think there are 2 points that are particularly salient and are particularly obvious. I think the first is about the overall sufficiency of the funding, the overall volumes of funding. We know that we're falling far short of meeting the $100 billion commitment from the Paris Agreement, and equally that the actual volumes that are being received by countries are very small. The second point here, and I think the critical point here when we're thinking about humanitarian crises, is that the volumes of assistance that are reaching countries that are in crisis, that are highly vulnerable to climate change, are significantly less than those that are being received by countries that are in a similar situation of climate vulnerability, but which are not experiencing humanitarian crisis. So here, and the difference on the chart you can see here is between those funds that are dispersed, that have actually been received, which are the purple part of the chart, and those which have been approved or committed, but which haven't been dispersed. Of those disbursements, only $1 per person is going to countries which have, are in protracted crisis or in humanitarian crisis and are highly vulnerable, compared to about $5 to those which aren't experiencing crisis but have a similar level of climate vulnerability. And these figures, just for clarity, are not in a single year, but are over a 20-year period. So the sufficiency question is critical here. It's not just about climate finance, of course, when we're thinking about responding to disasters and hazards that might be associated with climate change in countries that are experiencing humanitarian crisis. Disaster risk reduction obviously has a key role to play in terms of protecting development gains, ensuring that those are preserved, but also about kind of minimizing the impacts of disasters so that they don't worsen vulnerability or compound existing crises. As Nishani mentioned, there's a whole range of different objectives that drive these different forms of finance, and that's equally the case for disaster risk reduction, which is focused on natural hazards, not just those related to climate change, so also to things like earthquakes, for instance. And I think the key question or the key issue here is around the targeting of that disaster risk reduction finance. We know that disaster risk reduction responds to the risk of natural hazard, but not to the overall risk of or vulnerability to climate change, nor to other factors that might worsen or compound the impacts of those disasters, such as the presence of conflict or socioeconomic vulnerability. But also what we see is a high level of variance, and indeed no real pattern in terms of the choices that are made as to where that disaster risk reduction is targeted. So be that by country, be that by type of hazard, or by geography itself. In practice, what does that mean, and what are the impacts of this kind of lack of coordination and the levels of sufficiency? Well, I think the example from Pakistan, where two subsequent large-scale crises impacted the country over the course of a decade. We can see here, firstly, that the volumes of finance are very small, both in terms of the humanitarian response, which you can see on the bar on the side, where you can see the level of unmet needs and the level of committed finance, but also by the volumes of finance that you can see going towards DRR and to climate change adaptation. And I think the message that this shows is that the inadequate or insufficient degree of investment in resilience building meant that when a second flood hit in 2022, following floods in 2011, many communities did not have the resilience to be able to respond that, and that worsened the level of impact and also then the level of draw that was needed on humanitarian response. I think the second thing to note here in the example of Pakistan is also that by having an excessive burden on the mechanisms of the state, for instance, to respond, and the way in which finance is provided. So, for instance, in the 2011 floods, a high level of debt servicing on debt that was taken on in part to respond to those floods meant that the capacity of the state to respond, because of high levels of debt or the degree of revenue that was available, was particularly limited, therefore worsening the draw and the need on other forms of finance. So I think to conclude, I think we know that the humanitarian system itself is not able to deal with this change context of accelerating impacts of climate change. We know that funding from climate change adaptation, for humanitarian development, hasn't followed a consistent or a coordinated pattern of activities, nor has it had the right level of engagement of local actors. And we know that the result of this is that climate vulnerable communities are losing development gains and increasingly caught in cycles of crisis, unable to escape from those crises, which we see with the increased prevalence of protracted crisis. What do we need? Well, sufficiency is critical. Sufficiency to narrow the humanitarian financing gap, but also to provide more and additional climate finance. But we also need a significantly more coherent and joined up system, both across donors, through the funds that provide it, and across the recipients that receive that finance. Manisha, I'll stop there and pass back to you.
Thanks so much, Angus. And before I kind of come back on what you spoke about, Nishani is going to ask you a question from the audience. So Nishani, let me turn to you and then I'll come back.
Thanks. Angus, you mentioned that, typically in our humanitarian response and funding, et cetera, we're very much on the response piece and very rarely, more and more, very rarely on the preparedness piece, right? But now anticipatory action. So we have Adam putting a question to you, saying anticipatory action finance was generally rejected in the past, in the 1990s. How far has this really taken root? It makes enormously good sense in mitigating crisis disaster, meaning minimizing crisis and disasters. So that's one question to you. How has that taken root now? And I see there's quite a lot of interest in many donors on anticipatory action. And in reality, what does that mean to minimizing loss and damages, right? And that's the minimizing the impact of communities. Is that enough? Is that kind of sufficient? Is the funding sufficient? Is that the only type of response we should be doing? Lots of questions there, but maybe I can put that back to you to see what you can respond to.
Sure. Thanks, Shani. I think there are two things in terms of where the discussion on anticipatory action is at. I think rhetorically, for sure, I think there's much greater interest in anticipatory action. And I think we're seeing an increasing number of pilots and initiatives that are addressing those anticipatory, those pre-crisis forms of intervention. The reality is that those are still relatively, and in fact, in absolute terms, still pretty small scale. And I think there remains a significant challenge here, and in terms of a system that's insufficiently funded, and the level of risk that's involved. So there's both the level of risk in kind of innovating for new practices and new interventions to work out what works. That requires expending a very limited and scarce pool of funds on things that may not work. So I think that's one is partly about risk appetite, but also in the context where you have insufficient funding to address people who are already in need. The opportunity cost there is a difficult choice to make. I think increasingly donors are recognizing that that's a choice that they should start to be making. And so I think there is real appetite. And I think it's interesting that in the most recent iteration of the Grand Bargain, which has just gone through its second phase, is now entering its third phase, there is, I think, an increased interest in really putting some fire beneath the feet of anticipatory action and actually making a real go of this. However, I think those challenges around the choices that have to be made where you've got existing need that is unmet, and then investing in something, and in some cases investing in actions that might not, that I guess are kind of more difficult to also quantify as well. And so I think there's also that piece around the political piece about making the case and having the evidence to show that the investment in anticipatory action is one that you can both sell to your political masters, but also that it evidences a significant value for money investment as well. So I think, there's a chance we'll see more anticipatory action being pushed forward in the future. And I think there's more chance for this to take root than perhaps there was 10, 15 years ago. But I think I would still say it's kind of relatively nascent at the moment.
Super. Thanks so much, Angus. And I think that point around donors needing to see the value of anticipatory action is very similar to the point that they needed to see the value of DRR funding, that if you spent, $1 on DRR, I forget the statistic, that you would save $4 in humanitarian action or humanitarian response or whatever that was. I think there's a lot of times where that early spending can have a greater impact is something that a lot of times donors are not necessarily picking up on as quickly as possible. Thank you, $7 for a response for $1 spent in DRR. Thank you from Jennifer from Humanitarian and Inclusion. And I think a lot of the time is, humanitarian response is very easy to show what you're doing as a donor, is like, look at all this stuff we've delivered and all these lives we've saved, even though it may not be as great for media if you invest earlier on. And I think that's one of the challenges. But Angus, I think you put a really stark picture of kind of the state of humanitarian financing, the greater needs that we've got, the doubling of needs in the last 5 years, the fact that we have a very fragile system with the US, Germany, and the EU putting in 60% of humanitarian funding, which, as we know, could change on the dime of a political election. And I think that link also, but that how do you bring that in with the climate financing and the DRR financing, but then also that whole development financing piece, that debt that was taken on by Pakistan, is a really stark example of how those systems aren't necessarily coordinating as well as they could together. And I think oftentimes it's the left hand versus the right hand in the government doing one thing on the humanitarian side, maybe more than left and right hands, just given all the different pots of money. And some governments are definitely trying to move closer towards having better coordination, but it's been a long call for that coordination. I think the urgency is becoming much greater as we see, especially with that figure you put out about, $1 per person in a country where they're highly vulnerable to a climate crisis and the country's in crisis, and yet $5 in other places. And that's, again, where those development financing and the trust of a government also probably comes into play in those cases, making it a rather complex situation where we need to find some good advocacy messages to really push donors a little bit to see where we kind of bring in a little bit more funding so that we're spending it earlier on and not too late. Debbie, I'm going to turn to you. As I mentioned before, you're the head of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, and you're going to talk to us a little bit on some of the lessons from humanitarian response and the objectives and the intent on the humanitarian side, and a little bit how L&D, loss and damage negotiators, can learn from humanitarian actors. So Debbie, I'm going to turn to you, please.
Great, thank you very much. Just to clarify, I'm head of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance for Mercy Corps. So I'm employed by Mercy Corps, but that's fine. I'm part of that alliance. That's great. Can you just remind me how I do the presentation?
It's up now. You should be able to change the slides.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much. Wonderful. All right. So thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. So as mentioned, I'm going to briefly talk about how humanitarian insights can support the loss and damage discussions based on a paper that was published a few months ago. I'm just trying to change the slides. Sorry. There we go. So I felt driven to write this paper, having sat in the negotiations at COP last year, and being quite surprised at how little negotiators and their staff really understood humanitarian action. I was pretty stunned by the lack of knowledge, and on reflection, I think I shouldn't have been. I think we're all quite comfortable in our silos. We all have our own areas of expertise, and it's not surprising that climate negotiators don't understand the humanitarian world. But that's a gap that needs to be filled, because now, as we all know, there is this whole loss and damage discussion around funding happening in the climate space, and there is this link with humanitarian action. So that knowledge gap needs to be filled. So I wrote this paper, and I'm sure everyone on the call knows, but just very briefly, at the last COP, so COP27, that was the first time that the international climate process, that UNFCCC, has agreed to set up new funding for loss and damage. There has been a lot of technical work on loss and damage in the past, but developed countries up to now have resisted, previously blocked any calls for new loss and damage finance. So it was a huge breakthrough at the last COP, and the beginning of a vital process to address this critical gap in climate finance. So the last COP set up a transitional committee, which is meeting 4 times this year, to provide proposals to the next COP in Dubai this year on how to operationalize a new fund for loss and damage, and how to develop what they call funding arrangements. So setting up a new fund, that's pretty clear what that is. and this is what developing countries were really pushing for, a new fund. Funding arrangements is somewhat euphemistic, but what it means is looking at the existing funding solutions out there that cover a part of loss and damage. So humanitarian action obviously falls into this pot, but as well as insurance, the World Bank crisis response window, all the kind of big funding amounts from international financial institutions on reconstruction. So all those other bits of funding that already exist. So that's what the Transitional Committee is looking at this year, and big decisions to be made at COP in the coming year. And I'm sure Harjeet's going to talk to us a bit about that. So we need to, that's the paper. So we need to bridge this gap between international humanitarian action and loss and damage. And the Transitional Committee has been set up to seek coherence and complementarity with existing funding sources such as humanitarian funding. So the paper was written to that, written by Paul Knox-Clark of ALNAP and ADAPT, and myself, with input from lots of different people, quite a few of you on this call, IFRC, NGOs, experts, and others. And it's specifically written to those in the climate space, so the Transitional Committee negotiators and their advisors. It's not written for the humanitarian sector, it's written for the climate sector, trying to bridge this gap. And it is sort of driven by evidence of what the humanitarian sector has learned over many years of responding to rapid onset crises. So that's what the paper is. Sorry, I'm really not doing very well with these buttons. Here we go. So just really, really quickly, and some of this crosses over with what Angus has said, so I'm going to go very fast, but just to say that we all know this, that there is an increasing number of extreme events leading to loss and damage. This is an increasing problem that we collectively as an international community need to solve. And when we think about, we need to think about the role that humanitarian action plays in loss and damage. This is a slide that shows how loss and damage, how the international, the UNFCCC thinks about loss and damage. So you can see down the left-hand side, we have avert, minimize, and address. And this is what how the climate sector thinks. We need to avert loss and damage, we need to minimize it, and we need to address it. So averting loss and damage is making sure that to try and reduce as much greenhouse emissions. But we're not doing enough of that. So we have a gap in mitigation. Okay, so then we need to adapt more, and the more we adapt, the less damage there will be. But unfortunately, we're not doing enough adaptation either. And then we're not doing enough protection. So there's not enough social and financial protection, which means that we need to respond. So this is where the sort of humanitarian piece comes in, around social and financial protection and around response. But ultimately, we're not doing enough of any of this. So humanitarian role is really where everything else has failed. And, just to be really, really clear that all of these areas are important. So mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage are all critically important in addressing the climate crisis. So humanitarian action has an important role in loss and damage, but it is only one part of it. There's actually quite a wide variety of humanitarian action and humanitarian organizations. And this table is somewhat simplistic, but it's trying to show in the sort of middle column, this is broadly speaking what international humanitarian action can deliver in terms of loss and damage. And then on the right-hand side, then what actually isn't covered or certainly is not covered in much depth. And please note here that I'm talking about international humanitarian action. We should always remember that the first responders to disasters are always families, communities, local organizations, local government. It's only later, when scale is high, do international humanitarian organizations respond. But you can see then from this table that there are major gaps that the international humanitarian sector doesn't cover. So slow onset disasters such as sea level rise, all the longer term recovery piece, including reconstruction, and much of non-economic loss and damage. So things like cultural heritage and biodiversity isn't covered by international humanitarian action, or very, very little if it is at all. So that's just kind of scoping out the context. And then, so what are the lessons then from the humanitarian sector? And this is a slide you'll recognize from one of Angus's, and this is Development Initiatives data. So that humanitarian action is not fully funded. Now, this won't come as a surprise to any of you on this call, but it looks quite different from the climate perspective. So the loss and damage negotiators see that there's a humanitarian sector, it exists, there is some money in it, and therefore they don't see this as a gap in the kind of loss and damage funding space. So the fact that there isn't nearly enough humanitarian funding for response, never mind really critical things like preparedness and resilience building, that's a really important message for the climate sector to understand. And the key thing, the key difference between humanitarian climate finance is its principles, and I suspect Harji will touch on this. So humanitarian funding is discretionary and it's donor driven. So as Angus mentioned, much of the funding, well over half, comes from 3 big donors. And this leads to disparities in funding from one disaster to another. And these disparities are not necessarily related to the scale or the intensity of needs. So climate finance is very different. It's based on very clear principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, more sort of loosely translated as polluters should pay. So a very different kind of basis of funding. So when we're looking at funding, we need to make sure that that new loss and damage funding, this new loss and damage fund, should have very clear ways of apportioning finance, making sure that it's not as donor driven as the humanitarian sector, and it is based on these clear climate principles. Another message is that loss and damage funding should be designed for speed. So we as humanitarians often berate ourselves quite rightly for not being fast enough. And we do that because we know of the impacts that slow funding and slow response has on highly vulnerable women, men, and children. But nonetheless, humanitarian funding is significantly faster than most other systems out there. So, for example, the World Bank's crisis response window takes around a year to disperse after the crisis. And the Green Climate Fund, which is the biggest international climate finance fund, takes years from application to actual disbursement. So the humanitarian sector, imperfect though it is in many ways, has managed to set up systems that can respond quickly. So, I mean, on the slide here, we've just got a few ways that the humanitarian sector does this. So in terms of pooled funds, the SURF can take 12 days from proposal to disbursement, and actually in practice often happens faster than this. So for example, in Cyclone Ida in Mozambique, UNICEF started responding, 24 hours after the cyclone hit. And similarly, IFRC's DREF, the START Fund, country-based pool funds, these are all set up to respond quickly to disaster. Humanitarian system has set up systems and processes. I think many of you on the call are very familiar with all of these. So surge personnel, cluster system, FuseNet, the El Nino alert system, all of these systems have been set up to enable a fast response. And then we've already talked about anticipatory action. So that's a kind of, as Angus said, it's pretty small, but it's growing fast, and there's a lot of interest in anticipatory action. And then providing cash rather than goods in kind. So clearly, the Loss and Damage Fund shouldn't set up duplicatory processes and systems when this system already exists and is functioning reasonably well. And then Angus has talked about this one as well. So the need to look at communities which are affected by climate and fragility. Everything on this slide, it's a bit busy, apologies for that, is basically showing the large number of people that are affected by conflict and climate and how little funding they get. So my numbers seem to be slightly different to Angus's, and there's different ways you can cut this, you can look at the data, but it's really, really clear that those in fragile states do not get the climate finance that others do. And this is just the example from Somalia. So you can see there at the top, this is what Somalia's needs are, and this is mitigation and adaptation finance. So $5.5 billion a year. And this is actually what they get, $321 million a year. So, I mean, this is a huge, huge gap. So this is a real problem. And weirdly, it does seem to be a bit of a blind spot in climate finance. And And it's very interesting, this. It's partly because in the UNFCCC, there's actually no language to talk about. So we often use the phrase FCAS, don't we? Fragile, conflict-affected states. That's often, I mean, there's different phrases, but that's often the one that's used. But that language doesn't exist in the climate space. So the sort of groupings of countries that are talked about there are LDCs, SIDS, AOSIS, but there's no category for fragile and conflict affected states and no intention to create one. So it's quite difficult to talk about these kinds of countries. And this is problematic because climate finance instruments are very risk averse. You know, why would you fund a risky project in Somalia when you can fund a much safer and risk-free project in Botswana, say? So the result is that states and the affected communities within them are effectively marginalized. They're too difficult to support. And obviously humanitarians have huge expertise in this area. Around 80% of humanitarian funding takes place in these contexts. So the new Loss and Damage Fund needs to learn from this, designing funding approaches that have a higher tolerance for risk, that can provide funding to a variety of actors beyond a single government ministry or body, and that can incorporate conflict sensitivity. This is a genuinely tricky area, and it hasn't really been looked at very carefully up to now by the climate finance, by the climate community. So in the report, we propose some specific work in the climate space on this, either from the Transitional Committee or somewhere else. But this is an issue that needs to be discussed. And actually the UAE, the presidency of the next COP, has set up an informal working group to look at this area. There was a 2-day workshop on this issue in a couple of weeks ago to develop proposals for COP28. And also, interestingly, there is, for the first time ever, as you may know, COPs have thematic days, and there's a thematic day at the next COP on health and then relief, recovery and peace. So this is the first time that this kind of issue of peace has really been taken on by any of the presidencies. So as you know, the UAE is a massive humanitarian donor and really kind of wants to look at this issue of fragility. It's been doing this already in the Security Council. Now it's brought that interest into the COP system. So it's very interesting to see how this discussion develops and whether COP28 can propose some kind of new commitments or a new way of looking at these kinds of things. So I've only had a few minutes, so I've just highlighted a few things from the paper, but I hope that please do take an opportunity to look at the paper. There's more in there, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you, and back to you, Manisha.
Thanks very much, Debbie, and also for giving us that great overview sort of the differences between how the climate world and the finance and climate world works versus the humanitarian world. And I think how you get those to meet in a way that can meet the necessary speed and amount of funding that's required is going to be the big challenge. And again, different parts of governments are talking about different things, but not necessarily coming to the same sort of agreements. Nishani, I know you wanted to ask Debbie a quick question before we move to Harjeet, because I know we want to get to Q&A as well, and we're a bit short on time.
Yeah, Debbie, thanks so much for the presentation. Lots of food for thought. One of the questions that we have on the chat, and you mentioned about the types of loss and damage funding, and I mean the gaps in funding at the same time on humanitarian funding. But how will loss and damage funding affect humanitarian funding? Has there been some conversations and thought process around it? And is there going to be a shift of funds by developed nations? Do we see ODA being moved around and labeled differently? What are kind of the concerns that the humanitarian sector has? Would be great to hear from you. Over.
Yeah, these are really great questions, and I'm afraid I don't have any great answers. I think this is all being worked out at the moment. These are the kinds of things that are being discussed in the Transitional Committee. It's possible that the new loss and damage funding won't engage in the humanitarian side at all, that the humanitarian sector already exists. It should just carry on, and new loss and damage funding will go to other areas that aren't covered, like slow onset events, which really don't receive much funding at all, or non-economic losses and damages. So certainly some of the negotiators, that's what they're pushing for. And this comes back to my first point, because as I said, people on the climate side, people see, well, this sector exists, there's already money there, it's covered, let's cover the areas that's our new funding, should cover other areas. But none of this is yet worked out. We've had 2 meetings of the Transitional Committee. The third one is in August. Harjeet can probably say more about the tone of the discussions and where he thinks it's likely to go. But at the moment, I think it's a bit too early to say.
Super. Thanks so much, Debbie. And I think it's a perfect transition into what Harjeet's going to talk to us about. But really, thanks, Debbie. And people did ask for the link, so maybe you could just drop the link into the chat so people have that paper. That would be brilliant. Harjeet, I'm going to turn to you. And just as a reminder, Harjeet is the head of global political strategy with the Climate Action Network International, CAN-I. So Harjeet, you've heard both Angus and Debbie talking a little bit about the different types of financing, the different kind of needs that are out there, the fragility that's out there. How do you sort of reflect on those presentations, excuse me, in terms of how climate and loss and damage and humanitarian finance are conceived, and sort of what are some of those differences, and what are some of your reflections on their presentations, please?
Thank you very much, Manisha and Nishani, for having me. And it is indeed a very, very important conversation, and so useful to get the humanitarian climate community together, and I would say also development community together, to look at this issue from various dimensions. So let me underline and complement what Debbie and Angus have covered. First of all, when we talk about humanitarian finance and loss and damage finance, it's also useful to look at it from the perspective of scope and cause. Humanitarian finance, as we know, covers a range of crises, from conflicts and epidemics and natural disasters, and which are not natural anymore. So that's important. So when we look at the finance, we need to understand that it's covering the whole gamut and not just climate. When we talk about loss and damage, it's climate, from extreme weather events and slow onset events. Now that makes a huge difference in terms of the scale, and also to remind that it is as per the UN back in 2015, and we know climate disasters have increased. 90% of disasters that we face are climate related, and I'm sure that number must have gone up. Now, when it comes to the politics and the conceptual part of humanitarian finance, as we know, is well established and recognized, and as Debbie has been mentioning, it's clear mechanism. Even with all the challenges, the system is well oiled and makes a huge contribution in the aftermath of any such disaster. Whereas when we talk about loss and damage, and I can see a lot of questions, because it's a new field, it's still evolving, and although it has been on the agenda for the last 30 years, but only recently it got that momentum, starting with 2012. After the fight, we got the mechanism in 2013. And only in the last, I would say, a year or two, when we got finance strongly on the agenda in Glasgow, and then in 2021, and then finally we got that. At the same time, and the reason there was so much of delay to agree to this kind of financing mechanism that we are still trying to establish, so it's politically sensitive. It's tied to the principles of climate justice. It's about obligations. It's not a charity. It's not, we don't even call it aid. It's based on obligation. And that's a very, very important distinction, because that determines how we advocate for it. And I come from a humanitarian community, I must mention this. I used to be with ActionAid, and I have responded to various emergencies in India, in Asia, and Americas. So I know the kind of discourse we have had at UNDRR or in the humanitarian fora. So coming back to loss and damage finance, we talk about contributors and not even donors. Even that language is very different, because it's their obligation, it's based on equity. So I think that's an important distinction to know. And that also connects with the next part, which is a distinguisher, is in terms of sources and implementation. When we talk about humanitarian finance, it covers various diverse set of resources in government, private sector, charities, individuals, and so on. Whereas loss and damage finance, of course, it's new, but the way we are advocating for it, we are looking at governments to play a much bigger role, or be the primary contributor for these resources. Private sector will play a role, but it's going to be very different. We are talking about putting fines and penalties and taxes on private sector, particularly the most polluting ones. When we talk about fossil fuel industry or big ag or other polluting plastic industry, for instance. So they are going to be paying a lot more of course, they can pay from their CSR money, but it's going to be very different. And in terms of also looking at actions, of course, humanitarian is largely immediate and pressing needs and immediate crisis, also because of lack of resources. And it's happening more so as the number of disasters are increasing and needs are increasing even more. But humanitarian community has to respond to many crises, so they move from one to the other. Whereas when we talk about loss and damage finance, we are particularly, including, of course, covering the immediate response part, relief, but particularly focusing on rehabilitation and reconstruction. And as Debbie said, also slow onset, which is not currently being covered by the humanitarian system. Another aspect that I want to highlight, which is going to be discussed a lot more under loss and damage, addressing loss and damage and the finance part, is going to be displacement, which humanitarian community is unable to deal with because it requires a much longer term response, because we are not only looking at the immediate displacement that happens, but we also know that when people lose their land to sea, or places are becoming uninhabitable because of increased heat or desertification, they have to move permanently. So how do we look at the whole spectrum of displacement, migration, and even permanent relocation? So those are the things that are extremely important. And of course, the scale is huge. Angus was talking about billions of dollars. We know that just Pakistan itself had a loss to the tune of $40 billion. So the calculations that we are working with is $290 to $580 billion per year in developing countries alone by 2030. So yeah, just wanted to put things into context, Manisha.
Thanks, Harjit. That's a lot to unpack there. And I think you touched upon a few key things of, climate justice, and this is an equity and the obligations. We as a humanitarian sector are not always very comfortable to do and talk about this, right? So I think it's very key, and we've got a few questions on this on the chat, is, in that perspective, what do you think is one of the key aspects going towards COP28 and at the many stages of COP28? And I think it'll be good to also couple it with, what happened at Bonn. We heard many of our colleagues, NGO colleagues who are at Bonn, were very disappointed that, it was very politicized and there's a whole load of politics instead of decisions being made, that things didn't move forward enough, because normally this is the place to actually make the decision. So you may pave the way for the real, the finalization to happen at COP. So what is that, what does that look like in terms of, future of COP28 with a UAE strong position, as Debbie said? That's one. Two is then, what would humanitarian role be in terms of looking at this intersection between responding to what we're usually responding to in terms of, sudden onset, and now we're seeing drought, etc., desertification. Some parts of it we're dealing with, some bits of it because where we work, this is a big problem. But then the other aspects of it that we're not dealing with, the slow onset, like what you mentioned, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, all these that are also part of losses and damage. What is there a role for us, for example? What would then our advocacy look like? And how can we as a humanitarian community support also the climate community? Because I think in this game, if it's a game, because that's unfortunately what it is, to say plainly, we need to be together. And I think our artificial divides need to be broken down. And we need to look at what are the community needs, right? So what are your thoughts on some of those? Over.
Nishani, I would like to respond to your second question first, and then I'll come back to that one again. It's important because was what Angus and Debbie presented, and the kind of conversation we are having. It's very easy to misunderstand that we are talking about two very distinct issues or mechanisms. And again, that's why I keep telling people that I come from humanitarian sector. And back in 2009 and 10, when we started working on it, I said loss and damage is humanitarian plus. And I'm happy to stick my neck out and even talk to negotiators and say humanitarian system is very much part of it. Because when we talk about loss and damage finance or the response mechanisms, we are looking at the same development and humanitarian actors who are going to be now playing a much bigger role in responding to the situation. Honestly, there is no climate community, a very different climate community that brings those kind of very practical skills to respond to these situations other than the humanitarian community. And this is where I would say that at the ground level, let us not create and talk about different communities or create silos that will be detrimental to what is needed on ground. Of course, both processes, and that's why in the initial part I mentioned how these two are distinct yet connected. Because when we look at humanitarian community, what it brings is massive experience, both in terms of length and breadth and the depth of it. Because what we need to do right now is risk assessment. And we need to do that risk assessment across, talk about extreme weather events or slow onset events. A lot of experience of extreme weather events can be adjusted and be made applicable for even slow onset. Of course, we need to bring in new dimensions, but a lot of things are common. And we need to recognize how we have been using this experience for needs assessment and recognizing violation of people's rights when they face these disasters. A lot of experience with respect to preparedness. Preparedness, the reason I'm saying, which is just before a disaster hits us, is again going to be very, very valuable and is very much part of addressing loss and damage. A lot of awareness building that humanitarian community does, again, is an important part of any action that we take to address. And at this moment where we stand, where even the local actors and local governments and national governments need to be sensitized, and we need to have many players, we need to be bringing in those case studies, because when we talk about different kinds of impacts now, be it economic, non-economic, we have to bring in that aspect. So I see a lot of role that humanitarian community can play. I was particularly referring to displacement and migration. And I have also worked in various humanitarian situations. I can talk about tsunami because the scale was huge. It was not a climate induced disaster, but the kind of relocation we had to do when people lost their homes forever, that experience is there with the humanitarian community. It's now that we are looking at a very different scale. So there are a lot of things that humanitarian community brings. I just wanted to underline that point. And I'll come to policy part in a bit. Let me first cover what happened at Bonn. Now, we know that what we got at COP27 was not a mean achievement. It's massive. And it's tremendous, and especially the kind of political shift we have made in achieving that leap, where now loss and damage is seen as a separate issue, the way it was being tried to shove under adaptation. It now stands on its own. There's an agreement, and as Debbie was referring to transitional committee meetings, which we have attended, we find that the conversations are now about setting up those processes, whether it's funding arrangement, which includes humanitarian, or new loss and damage fund. And the conversation is moving forward, and now we need to make sure that it's not an empty pot. And they're getting granular. And in fact, at the Glasgow dialogue in Bonn, we heard even rich countries recognizing that how the funding has to be more programmatic, has to be more country and community led, or we also call it locally led, and even trigger based, and not based on you prepare a project proposal. So a lot of learning that has come from humanitarian development communities finally influencing the way we are going to design this fund and funding arrangements. Now let me talk about the differences. We as civil society and developing countries look at loss and damage fund as the main part, whereas the other language of loss and damage funding arrangement, we see that supporting and working in conjunction. Whereas for rich countries, funding arrangement part is much bigger and fund is a tiny part of it. Now that's where we don't agree, because if we go with that narrative, then we are looking at a tiny fund, which is going to focus much more on slow onset events and non-economic loss and damage, because that's an apparent gap. And of course, there are other solutions being proposed. And the reason we see that rich countries pushing for this much more, because they want to control the funding that is outside loss and damage fund, because then it doesn't come under the umbrella of UNFCCC. And we know that this is where it comes to the geopolitics, because then what Angus was sharing in terms of need and gap, it's going to always remain, because some so-called donors are going to determine where the funding is going to go. More and more money, if you are able to bring it under UNFCCC, which has set principles based on equity, based on obligation, will be able to ensure a lot of money. I think this is what humanitarian community needs to really understand, that, and this is where let me start to respond to your point or your question, Nishani, what we have to do together. Humanitarian community should see, and that's why I also emphasize that the money is going to eventually come to the humanitarian community, because that's the implementation mechanism that we have. There's nothing else compared to what we have as part of humanitarian system, which means that we all have to come together and advocate for a much bigger loss and damage fund, so that we are able to ensure it's obligation based, it's monitored well, and we don't see those gaps that we saw in the slides presented by Angus. And 3 words which Debbie also emphasized, and let me put all those 3 together, where what we are fighting for are scale, speed, and access. So I already mentioned we are looking at hundreds of billions of dollars. We are looking at speed because the current system is not helping. We have humanitarian system, acting immediately, but not at that scale. And we are looking at a very different measure now. And access part, where we want to see not proposals being written and communities waiting for months and years, and how we can do that. And last bit I want to say also on sources, I think it's also important to recognize that we are not looking at loans. And again, Debbie was highlighting, and we've seen for humanitarian response or helping people recover from impacts, we can't depend on loans. It's double injustice. People who are least responsible for the crisis are facing the worst impact, and then we are asking them to take money as loan. That's injustice, and we can't just allow that to happen. And we are looking at public finance primarily. Even when we say private sector, as I said earlier, it should be taxed. And as we speak, there's a meeting happening in London where discussion is happening on shipping tax, which is already kind of being discussed under loss and damage mechanism, where part of that levy can actually help raise money. So to my very last bit, in terms of what humanitarian community can do on the policy side, I know, again, as part of humanitarian community, we don't challenge our governments enough. We don't, put pressure on what we call donors in the humanitarian community and contributors in the climate change context. We need to do a lot more, and we need to do it to make sure that the money is raised at a scale at which it's needed and based on obligation. We also need to make sure that money is spent well, which means even in the developing global south countries, we have to put those systems in place, because we are looking at a very different scale right now. So how do we really work together to demand accountability from all actors across the board? And this is where we have to get really, really political in our demands, which is quite a departure from what humanitarian community has been engaged in for so long.
Thanks very much, Harjeet. And I think that's probably a really good segue to kind of a lot of the questions that we have in the Q&A, because I think that sort of political demands that is not usually what we do as a humanitarian community. And I guess that's where that complementarity can really come in between the development actors, the humanitarian actors, and those that are doing kind of the climate change advocacy in particular. There were a few questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to throw this back to all 3 of you, to whoever wants to answer them. On that last one, this issue about how do you sort of prioritize, given the scale of the problem in loss and damage can sometimes be so colossal, it's difficult to see what can be prioritized given scarce resources. How do the L&D actors address prioritization? And I guess that would link very much also to how do humanitarian actors, given the lack of funding in the humanitarian system, then also do that prioritization? How do we make that advocacy at COP28, but also towards humanitarian donors kind of come together, given the huge needs that we have in humanitarian financing that Angus, Debbie, and Harjeet, you've all spoken to. There's also another question. I'm just going to give you a couple more so that we've got a lot. because there's so many, and I do encourage the three of you to please type in some answers, or we're not going to get through all of them. Coming back to that point that you made, Harjeet, around the shipping industry, can you give an estimate of what level of taxation would be needed on the shipping industry, for example, to reach the level of funding needed for L&D? And I guess that's going to be a question in many of those other platforms around the taxation that you talked about, Harjeet. Will that taxation come through, or are all those big industries going to be much more politically stronger in their lobbying than we're going to be on the humanitarian side? And how do we kind of learn maybe lessons from the big corporations and the way they do lobbying with governments? Because I often see us, asking for very little amounts of money, and big corporations will lobby to get much more in a much more effective way. Maybe we're not throwing enough behind our advocacy and lobbying. And maybe just one more question, the development community in this context, what is their role? Harjeet, you talked about the gap between the humanitarian community and the climate side, which was evident at COP, but what is the role of the development community, and where do they stand in the conversations around L&D funding? So I'll throw those three back to you, and then we'll come back with some more. I don't know who wants to go first. Debbie, please.
Great, thank you. All brilliant questions. And I think in terms of how do you prioritize, again, the honest answer is this is genuinely difficult. But it's particularly difficult because in terms of the loss and damage fund, at the moment, what we have is a bucket. The fund has been set up, but currently it's empty. So, the first thing is to try and get some funding into that bucket. So Harjeet's mentioned the International Maritime Organization discussions this week. There's been talks about carbon tax on air travel and other things for many years, and none of this has quite landed. So the shipping levy that Harjeet was talking about is our kind of best opportunity at the moment to kind of get an international agreement, because these things are genuinely hard, and the UNFCCC will say we don't have the mandate for that. So lots of hope on the International Maritime Organization. Let's hope that they deliver. There was also hope last week on the summit, the Macron-Modi-Motley summit that was held in Paris. This was a really fabulous initiative, really spearheaded by Mia Motley from Barbados, to look at to try and question the way the international finance world works. So really looking at the mandate and the role of the World Bank and the other IMF and the regional development banks, because this is where the real money is at. We humanitarians think we're really, really important, and we do have an important role. But if we look at all of the amount of funding that goes into loss and damage, the actual biggest amounts of money are for the kind of reconstruction end, not the kind of first phase respond end where most of us are working. This is where the big money is. This is the stuff that comes from the World Bank and others similar. And as Harjeet said, this is pretty much all loans, or very, very heavily loans rather than grants. So countries are getting into masses of debt in the reconstruction, and they've barely finished reconstructing after the last cyclone, and then the next cyclone comes, and it is a cycle of debt. And these international finance institutions, were set up actually just before the end of World War II, and set up and driven by, the richer countries for their reconstruction. We now need a brand new vision for how international climate finance writ large needs to work, and this assumption that developing countries are just going to get into debt because of climate impacts, and that's just something that they have to deal with on their own, is something that we as climate activists, let's say the climate community, and I include humanitarians in that, need to be challenging. So I think there are lots of complicated issues here that we need to unpack. So the Paris summit, I think for many people was a disappointment in that it didn't get very far, but at least the conversation's on the table. So, for all of us who work in any area of finance, whether they'd call themselves climate or humanitarian or both, this is a really important track to be following to get more money into the loss and damage bucket. Thank you.
Super. Thanks very much. Angus, please.
Yeah, just to build on sort of Debbie's points around prioritization, I think, and actually in your paper, Debbie, as you highlight very well, I think one of the things about the loss and damage fund, which I think one of the learnings from humanitarian response is to not make it kind of discretionary, but also to have very common, transparent criteria for its allocation. So I think there's something at the global level which talks about the prioritization, which means that what then flows to the country. But I think what's also critical then is the process in terms of the prioritization at a country level, because I think the risks and some of the process and the learning from humanitarian, but also from the development community, is by having kind of dislocated funds with individual objectives, then often it's certain actors who receive funding at certain locations. And what you don't tend to have, or what can be the case, is that those prioritization decisions are not informed necessarily by the national and indeed the local needs. And so that connection between kind of centralized government, but also localized needs is also critically important. And so I think that's a critical element of this kind of prioritization choice. Yes, it's about kind of how we make those allocations to the country level, but equally it's also about how those decisions are informed at a local and national level. And that means designing processes which enable effective participation of local and national actors. And that's not always easy, as we know, in kind of conflict affected states. That's not necessarily always going to be the central government. And there are questions about legitimacy as well. They're not these are knotted questions, but I think they're critical ones in terms of how we think about those questions of prioritization and allocations. And then I think the second question was also, or I think we also talked about kind of the engagement of the development community. There have for as long as perhaps even I've been alive now, which is quite a long time now, there have been conversations about how do we kind of better join up the humanitarian, the development, the peace building response. And now when we think about the climate response, there are perhaps now, there's been an increased focus again around these questions around the nexus and about coherence. I think for me, there are a couple of things. I mean, I think many of the conversations that have taken place or are taking place at the moment are kind of quite conceptual, and actually where we're seeing changes take place and where there's kind of practical positive examples is more at a kind of a country and implementation level. And I think critically for me, I think when we're talking about these questions about how do you conjoin, how do you make coherent choices about allocations of finance, whether that's development, humanitarian, climate, peace building, there is something around ensuring that there's a common sense of outcomes rather than kind of programmatic objectives. So this is about clearly understanding what you're seeking to achieve, and then ensuring that even when you have separate funds for disaster risk reduction, separate funds for climate, there is inbuilt flexibility to enable the blurring of the lines between those to achieve kind of common outcomes. So I think there are design questions which relate to all forms of finance, and typically questions around predictability, flexibility are critical to those to enable that kind of flexibility to fill in the gaps that we know that currently exist. So that's one thing. And then I think the final point on this kind of the engagement of the development community or other actors is there are still, and maybe this webinar is one of those steps towards that better understanding of different communities. And I think there are, it's still the case that I think different communities don't understand the objectives, the incentives, the interests well enough to then be engaged in a kind of a collective conversation. And I think that needs to happen at both, all different levels. That's kind of, these are strategic questions about how governments allocate their whole pots of development assistance, but it also happens at a country level, it also happens at a local level. And I think those conversations and that explicit understanding of interest and incentive, I think is critical to kind of breaking down some of these silos.
Thanks so much, Angus. And like you, I've been around for almost as longer. I think I've been longer than these conversations around humanitarian and development, but I feel like the push maybe with the climate change and the loss and damage may be a real game changer, hopefully, in bringing that coordination more to the forefront so that we've got that and understanding those outcomes more could be helpful. Harjeet, please.
Let me very quickly compliment on some of the things that Angus and Debbie covered. On shipping, and the estimate that's being made is about $30 billion that can be raised without putting a lot of pressure on the shipping industry. And in fact, Barbados has a very clear proposal on how we need $100 billion, and that has a combination of taxing the fossil fuel industry, and even we are talking about financial transaction tax. In fact, I was in Paris where at a side event, Timmermans from the European Commission also said that Europe is open to the idea of financial transaction tax. So many of these options are already there, have been there on the table for a very long time, but have not been really picked up. And as Debbie said, with shipping, there could be opening for other such what we call as innovative sources. The other thing that happened at Paris, and something to take note of, which is very important for this conversation, is debt suspension. When a country is going to be hit by a disaster, then and there has been a consensus that there are those going to be clauses under those loans that if you are hit by a disaster, then you don't have to do your debt servicing immediately. That there will be a pause for that. Of course, it doesn't go far enough. We have been calling for debt cancellation, knowing how a majority of countries are facing much deeper crisis, which cannot be solved through just suspension. It's a step in the right direction. On what Debbie said in terms of reconstruction, rehabilitation, yes, there's a good conversation. The only challenge is that depending predominantly on private sector and loans, which is not going to be helping. Because when we talk about loss and damage finance, we are talking about lost development. We are not talking about now going for new development or meeting the development deficit, something that was there and got eroded. And in that situation, we cannot talk about loans. It has to be grant. Of course, we are looking at the whole spectrum that now that development needs to be more resilient, but that's the differentiator. And on national level, I totally agree with what Angus said. I think historically it has been a situation that different concepts evolved at different point in time. But when it comes to local level, we have to break those silos. We have to make sure that structurally it all comes together nationally, locally, and programmatically. And one good example is where many of the island states I have seen either there's a very close coordination between the humanitarian system that they have in terms of home affairs or and then the environment community. I've seen recently in a big country like India, where now the National Disaster Management Authority has been tasked to even be part of negotiations on adaptation, loss and damage. So a system like that, where a disaster management body whose day job is actually respond to disasters begins to get into climate conversation, I think it can change a lot in terms of real action on ground.
Thanks, Harjeet. Thanks, everyone, for your insights on this. And because we are really running out of time, we have 7 minutes more to go. We have 2 questions. One of the questions that keep recurring, and I've been hearing this across the board in different conversations that we've been at as humanitarians, and part of all these conversations where we are looking at these, what could be the ways of getting money to conflict-affected contexts and fragile contexts, and difficult, to work with governments that are not the most equitable if you're wanting to look at how local funds are going to go, noting that our sector is not the best at local funding, as we saw it Angus's presentation. What are the opportunities that something like a country-based pool fund, where there could be funding directly with the due diligence risk assessment processes, and we talked about the risk appetite aspect as well, would that be one of the options that we could be looking at as a collective, as a whole? Is this something that needs to be unpacked more in terms of the transitional committee and the conversations that's going on what these mechanisms could be look like, so that funds go directly to communities? And then what would be the options of, we're going to see difficulties when it comes to local money as possible on loss and damage to communities, because governments are going to not be very happy about that, right? And this is, I think, one of the key kind of the elephants in the room, where if you want local money as possible, we need to look at different channels of going local as possible, and not just the typical government infrastructures of funding mechanisms. So that's 2. So the last one is what your one top line that you want to leave us with, that we need to continue our conversations and how we need to go together forward. Over. Whoever wants to take it first.
Debbie's got her hand up. Debbie, please.
Great, thank you. So I think in terms of looking at climate finance for fragile states, I think there's one issue around doing climate finance differently. So I think, as I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, there's very little risk appetite. So humanitarians are used to dealing with risk and working in difficult contexts, and and we always understand that's not easy, but it is something that humanitarians are quite used to. Much less so, obviously, in the development and climate sector. This is something where there is a much lower risk tolerance in general. So if we want to move the dial on this, then it's definitely about getting projects, programs, funders to think differently about risk. And some of that is just about a more nuanced understanding of risk. You know, we can't say that all of one country is completely impossible to work in. It might be one geographic area actually is difficult, but actually a lot of other places aren't. So essentially a more detailed and more sophisticated understanding of risk is really important to kind of really move the dial on this risk appetite. And just in the GCF, so the Green Climate Fund, as Mercy Corps and as the Zurich Alliance, we've been pushing this for quite a while. And I think we're starting to see a bit of movement on this. I think it's going to take a while. But there is definitely been some resistance to it, and we're just starting to see a bit of movement. So there's a principle there around risk appetite and as I said, a more nuanced understanding of risk. And then there's the tools on how to do that properly. So, you know, it is difficult to work in these environments. So need different operational tools, funding tools to enable a bit more of an adaptive approach to working. And again, this isn't typically how many funders work, but it's really necessary. And then just the last thing to say around the funding, trying to get it as local as possible. So accessing these kind of big chunks of money for climate finance requires a lot of kind of very high fiduciary standards, which many organizations can't meet. But there are definitely ways of getting around this, and in terms of the localization as well. So could a big international climate fund basically provide the funds to an aggregator or an intermediary, which then disperses it in much smaller pockets to different organizations? So then you get around the kind of some of the fiduciary aspects, and also you get the funding to a more local level. And then you also you do also spread the risk a little bit, and you can work through actors in slightly different ways. So again, we're starting to see a bit more of that. And I think that's definitely something that would be good to take forwards, to scale up, to make sure far more chunks of funding work in that way. I think that's got some real advantages in terms of getting funding much more to the local level to respond to the local needs.
Super. Thanks very much, Debbie. Harjeet, Angus, one quick last line or any thoughts on the finance question? Because we're running out of time.
Yeah, I mean, one very quick one. I think to echo Debbie's points, and I think when you mentioned specifically the country-based pooled funds, I think they maybe provide some model and some learning, whether these are themselves the mechanisms through which climate finance should be directed. I would kind of question perhaps, but I think there's a lot to be learned from them. And I think Debbie's point about kind of having an intermediary that enables better access, that enables some of these questions, because the country-based pooled funds themselves do a good job, but a limited job. And in terms of scale that we're talking of, I don't think perhaps they're the right ones, but I think a lot to learn from that. And I think some sort of intermediated pooled fund definitely is the way to go for this kind of thing. And I think as a final closing remark, I think from me, from somebody who looks at data quite a lot, I think the accountability question is still critical in terms of the reporting of the existing funding we have and whatever funding we have through the Loss and Damage Fund. We need to do a lot better in terms of being clear on what funding is going where, because that's also about kind of accountability and ensuring that it's going to the right places and the right people in the right form.
Super. Thanks so much, Angus. Harjeet, please.
Very quickly on in terms of access, we submitted a proposal last year when the discussion was about facility and not fund. We talked about a small grant window alongside extreme weather and slow onset, which can actually be very useful in terms of responding to such situations in fragile states and conflict affected areas. That's one. Second, in terms of, and that's my closing point as well, which is probably my appeal. We all must come together and demand that, as I said earlier, we need money that comes as part of obligation and not charity. And I can tell you there's a politics happening where rich countries are going to point towards the humanitarian aid so that they can keep that money outside UNFCCC. And we know the gap. We have seen those graphs. I don't have to prove anything to anybody. It's important to understand the politics, and let's all come together and talk about obligation-based money and the scale, as I said, scale, speed, and access. It can only be ensured if that money comes under UNFCCC, and trust me, and I can bet, money is going to come to the same humanitarian community, same development community, and same community that deals with conflict situation. So let's not get into the trap of divide and conquer, which some people are trying to play. Let's talk about what is needed and how we can make sure that it's delivered to people who are facing the climate crisis right now.
Thanks very much, Harjeet. And that's kind of a potentially controversial whole other webinar. We can have that last point in terms of going for all the money under UNFCCC versus the other humanitarian financing. So
sorry, I have to clarify. I'm not saying everything comes under UNFCCC.
Okay, good.
A system that anchors and makes sure that money is delivered. Those streams are going to continue, but the accountability, as Angus was saying, can only be ensured when it comes under UNFCCC. Not really the money, but the accountability part.
Right. And I think that accountability, thank you for that clarification, because I was like, oh, that's a whole other conversation. Anyway, it's been a hugely informative webinar. So huge thanks to Debbie, Angus, Harjeet for really covering a great amount of information. I think it's really putting the challenge out there that as humanitarians, we're consistently going to be facing a lack of funding, but that if we are pushing collectively with other actors for money to be going into climate change for that obligation purpose, so it's not just about meeting humanitarian needs, but really meeting the obligations that come about because of climate change and what's happened there, that we collectively can have a much stronger advocacy position in terms of really pushing those climate change negotiations. And I think it's how do we also work better together with climate change activists, development actors, and also peace actors to make sure that we're getting money into those contexts where people are facing crises and the impacts of climate change. And I think really showing what it is that we understand is happening on the front lines as humanitarian actors, local, national, international ones, and showing that the impact of crises, conflict, protracted crises doubled up with climate change is really putting people more at vulnerability, and that we are the ones that can help respond to that. So finding ways to make sure we get money to those local actors much more quickly, looking at different innovative means, whether it's through those intermediaries or using different kinds of pooled funds, not necessarily climate country-based pooled funds, but really learning what works well, what doesn't work well will be really critical, but that we need to be collectively pushing towards getting that the amount of money that's required in order to meet the climate justice options, but meeting those humanitarian needs that come about will be really critical as well. And I think it's probably the beginning of a longer conversation of how do we do that collective advocacy coming up to COP28, but also as the Loss and Damage Fund is being put into place, making sure that accountability is there and that we're not trying to divide and conquer, as you said, Harjeet, but that we're all working towards making sure there is enough money from all those different pots that is going towards people who are the most affected. With that, huge thanks to the audience. Apologies, we did not get to all of the questions. I'm going to, again, plead to our panelists to try to answer some of those. And if we do have some answers in writing, we'll be able to put those on the website. We do have a short evaluation for you to please put in. Apologies again for going over time. Vaughn's just dropped that into the chat. We will have a recording of the event, both in video and audio only podcast format on the website page, the event page, in the coming days. And again, huge thanks, Angus, Harjeet, Debbie, for your interventions. Nishani is my co-host, ICFA and PHAP colleagues for the background support, and to all of you in the audience for all of your excellent questions and contributions. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in yet another webinar, I'm sure, in the coming months. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your days, evenings. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.